Okay, just making sure that's working. There we go, transcription. Wonderful. So yeah, very good afternoon to everyone who's kind of joined us for this first in kind of like a two-part series of sessions around kind of generative AI. My name's Chris Webb. I'm an Alumni Career Consultant with the Careers and Employability Service. And I suppose I wouldn't class myself as an AI expert. I'd probably class myself as someone who's just spent a bit too much time on it over the past kind of year, particularly with kind of reference to career development work, but also sort of more broadly looking at changes that have taken place across the AI space in that time. So that's kind of where these training sessions came from, really. And I'm generously been joined by Steve Bentley today, who's going to be delivering part of the session. So Steve, do you want to come in quickly and just introduce yourself before we start?
Yeah, hi, I'm Steve. I'm the strategic LTA in the teaching and learning team essentially. So we looked after the university's policy around AI as it is. So I'll be giving some insight into how the university is trying to address AI.
Great stuff. Thanks, Steve. So as I say, we are recording this session. So again, if you don't want to appear on the recording, please do feel free to kind of turn your camera off. We'll go through some kind of notes for the session in a second in terms of kind of ground rules, questions, all those kind of sorts of things. But to start with, really, I just want to provide a little bit of an introduction to the session. So the idea behind these two sessions that are coming up, the one that we've got today and the one on the 15th of Feb, are really about trying to kind of provide, I guess, a bit of a grounding in what's happening with generative AI at the moment, generative artificial intelligence, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail in the session today, but also to kind of talk a little bit about the way forward, I suppose. So the actual kind of practical use cases that people are using AI for in the workplace, which is going to be the main focus of the next session. And this session really is to kind of build us up to that point with reflecting back on the kind of time since November 2022, when ChatGPT first dropped, and kind of the developments that we've seen since then and how that's kind of impacted the workplace and sort of society more generally. So I mentioned introduction to myself. You also get to see some lovely pictures of me as created by AI in various different guises, as a cowboy, astronaut, etc. And this is really just a foreground that a lot of the stuff that I'll be showing in the presentation today has been kind of co-created with AI, just to kind of give you a sense of some of the stuff that we're able to do with it, whether it's the frivolous stuff like you can see here, or whether it's stuff that's going to have a more, I guess, significant impact on the work we do. And this is just one example from a kind of piece of AI software that's been getting a lot of publicity recently called HeyGen. Now, this is an extremely basic version that I'm going to show you. So I'm just going to play this first to give you an indication. Hello, I'm Chris Webb, and welcome to this training session on a year of AI. Where are we now? Believe it or not, this is not actually me speaking to you. So enjoy the wonders of generative AI for the remaining 2 seconds of this video. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that is not the most impressive of kind of AI videos. Now, this is something that I was able to kind of cook up in about 2 or 3 minutes with a still image of myself and a clip of my voice and some text that I kind of put into the system. If you've seen some of the more advanced versions of the stuff on HeyGen, so in the paid versions of the software, you'll see that people are actually able to record about a minute's worth of themselves speaking, and then essentially using text generate that same image of themselves saying absolutely anything in any language, you know, really kind of about as realistically as you might expect from something like that. So it's really, really impressive, and also kind of quite scary to see how quickly that type of technology is moving, which is part of kind of why we've wanted to put these sessions together. So as I say, we've got a few things that we're going to cover today. So we're going to start off just by talking a little bit about generative artificial intelligence kind of 101. What are the main things you need to know if you've kind of not come across the subject in that much detail? What are the key things that it's important to be aware of? I'm then going to break down kind of the timeline of what's happened over the past year with generative artificial intelligence. So how things have progressed over the past year, and particularly in terms of developments within the kind of the software, the tools, how these are being used. We're then going to move on and talk a bit about the higher education sector specifically, and that's where Steve's going to come in and share some of the details about what's happening across the university in relation to AI. And then we're going to finish by sort of looking ahead really to sort of 2024 onward and what might be next with generative artificial intelligence, and leading into the next session on the 15th of Feb for those who are able to attend. As we kind of move through the session, please do sort of share your thoughts and questions in the chat. As I mentioned, my colleague, Julie Bagat, Career Consultant with the Career Service, is very kindly monitoring the chat for us today. So we are going to try and pick things up as we go through the session. Hopefully there will be some time at the end for Q&A, but I'm really keen that if things sort of come up as we sort of move through the session itself, feel free to kind of raise them then and there, pop the questions in the chat, and Julie, you're more than welcome to interrupt me at any point if there's kind of particularly sort of pertinent things we might want to kind of cover. The second kind of caveat really to this session is, although, as I say, I've spent a lot of time looking at generative AI over the past year, I'm definitely not an expert. I think you'd be very hard placed to find people who are genuine experts in the subject, given how quickly it's developing, and actually kind of how, I suppose, really, it's only really burst into the mainstream perhaps over the past year or so. So that's kind of just something to bear in mind. I'm not positioning myself as an expert here, but really sharing reflections that I've taken from my experience over the past year. And keeping all of that in mind, there's no silly questions here. You know, whether you're kind of completely new to AI or whether it's something that you've kind of started to touch on, still feeling a little bit kind of anxious about, any questions really related to what we talk about today, really keen to pick up any sort of perspectives, thoughts that are either kind of contrary to what I'm talking about or kind of support some of the stuff that we're talking about. Very, very happy to hear those. And to start that, really, I just want to kind of get a sense of where people are at the moment. So what your kind of current position is in regard to kind of your awareness of AI and sort of how you're using different AI tools. So in a second, I'm going to change screen. I'm going to bring up a Mentimeter on screen. All you'll need to do with this is just either on your computer or on your phone, go to menti.com. Again, all of the instructions will appear on the screen. And I just really want to kind of find out two things, really. So number one, where do you feel you're at the moment in terms of your confidence with AI? And this would kind of be, how aware are you of AI? Do you know kind of what's happening with AI, how things have changed over the past year? How sort of confident are you in your knowledge of AI? And that's going to be on a 1 to 10 scale. And then the second thing is competence. So again, this is really kind of about how much you're using it. So how, you know, competent do you feel you are at using things like ChatGPT or other AI tools, or do you feel you're more towards kind of the bottom end of the scale? And again, this isn't really to kind of see sort of expose people to say, you know, who's doing well with it, who's not. It's very much just to find out what our kind of baseline is at the moment within this group of people, and so we can maybe tailor some of the content that we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to stop sharing screen. I'm going to come over to the Menti, and then hopefully people should be able to see that in a second. Just while we're doing that, Julie, anything in the chat that we need to pick up just before I share screen?
I think most people were just saying a lot of people are like just keen to learn more, and we've got obviously lots of staff from across different areas of the university, which is great.
That is fantastic. Thanks very much. Okay, so I'm going to put this on the screen now, and hopefully you should be able to see this in present mode. There we go. So some instructions should be appearing on screen any second now, and these instructions are going to tell you how to access the Menti. So just give me a second. There we go. So on screen, you'll see that the website you need to go to is www.menti.com. You can then enter the code, or if you've got your phone with you, you can scan the QR code that's on the screen now. I'm just going to leave this up for about another sort of 30 seconds to a minute. And then what I'll do is I'll move on to each slide so that we can kind of see what people are thinking in terms of where you'd score yourself with your confidence with AI and competence. So yeah, give people a couple of minutes to do that, and we'll have a look at the results. Should point out as well, if anyone's got any issues accessing the Menti, if it's just not working for you at all, do feel free to share any kind of thoughts in the chat if you're happy to share them. The Menti is anonymous, so whatever kind of scores you're putting, it's just going to show the baseline, the average across everyone that's kind of contributing to the survey. But if you do want to share any thoughts in the chat instead, absolutely fine. Okay, great. So hopefully we're starting to see some people's responses come through. I can switch back to the instructions if that's easier for people. Just let me know. But you should see at the top, again, the website address and also the code if you do need to join there. So thanks for those who are kind of putting things in so far. It's good, you know, starting to see kind of the bars sort of tick a little bit, some up, some down. So we'll just give you again about sort of a minute or so to fill that in if you haven't already, with the score that kind of best represents you. Again, 1 would kind of be lowest level of confidence, competence, 10 highest level. And yeah, once we've kind of had people's responses, we'll have a look and see what that might kind of tell us about how people are feeling. Okay, so yeah, hopefully you can all see that on screen. Okay, Julie, if you don't mind coming in, can you see the Menti on screen? Is that coming through for you as well?
Yeah,
Wonderful,
definitely
good
see
stuff.
that.
Yeah, yeah, always my pet hate with Teams. Doesn't have that side by side view unless it's just me. So yeah, thanks for those who kind of filled that in. Yeah, as I say, sort of the idea behind this really is just to sort of find out as a collective where people feel they are. And I think like looking at these results, it feels like quite a realistic approach people have taken. So there's no sort of extremely high scores, people feeling like they're maybe kind of very confident, very competent. And I think actually in the position in time we're in with AI and how quickly it's developing, that's quite a logical position to take, because there's so much kind of going on. The speed of development is so rapid, as we'll talk about today, that actually it's very, very difficult to feel like you're completely on top of what's happening in terms of your awareness of what's going on with AI, but also in terms of kind of competence. Everyone's still kind of feeling out, playing around with a lot of the tech to sort of find out how it might work best for them. So I think those kind of those scores are sort of probably what I would have expected, and sort of gives us quite a good starting position to go from. We will be kind of doing this survey again at the start of the next session. Interesting to see if anything from today's session, if you attend both, potentially has an impact. But the idea of these sessions is not necessarily to kind of guarantee you to move forward in these confidence and competence categories, but more to get you thinking, I suppose, kind of critically about where you position yourself at the moment, and what you might want to do or need to do if you do want to kind of move those categories forward. So thank you for everyone that shared that, and please do feel free to kind of pop in the chat if there's any sort of additional thoughts you'd want to add in relation to that. So I'm going to move back to the presentation now. Again, I'm just going to ask you, sorry, Julie, going to bring you in again and just ask you if you can see that okay. Is that back on the PowerPoint for us?
Yeah, I can
Wonderful.
see that okay.
Thank you. I won't bother you anymore. Okay, fantastic. So we're going to start just with a bit of a potted history, I guess, of generative AI, because I think it's one of those things where it's a subject that's been talked about and talked about and talked about over the past year. But actually, there's been a huge amount of work, research, and actually the technology being developed over a much longer period of time. ChatGPT, I think, really caught people off guard. That kind of launch in November 2022 really got people going, oh, wow, this new technology's here. But actually, as we'll kind of talk about, there's been a lot of work going on in this space for quite a bit of time. There's been quite a lot of work that's gone into products like chatbots, which use some of this technology over a much longer period of time, some of which you may even have kind of encountered. So I think it's important to kind of preface a lot of this stuff with, actually, yeah, the reality is AI has been around for a while. Lots of work's already been undertaken on this subject. So AI predictive text models, which is some of the stuff we're going to be talking a little bit about today, have been around in some form or another since the 1960s, obviously to greater or lesser degrees of quality. And lots of companies have been researching or putting money into this type of research for a while. Google Brain AI, their research team was created as early as 2011. And actually even the kind of precursor to ChatGPT, which was OpenAI's GPT-3 model, was originally released back in 2020. So you've actually kind of got a lot of this technology that's been around for a while, and indeed, like many of us, actually use it probably more regularly or have come across it more regularly than we might think. So anyone who uses Netflix, for example, that kind of algorithm that works out what is it that we want to signpost you towards, what is it we want to direct you to, people have been using that for a number of years. And predictive text on kind of application forms online, autofills, those sort of things, and kind of various chatbots in different iterations for customer service and this sort of stuff have all existed in different forms for a number of years. So it's always kind of important to remember with this, although there's been quite a lot of hype about AI, it is a technology that's developed over quite a long period of time. And we've seen similar things with stuff like virtual reality, which is now getting to a point where it's getting a bit more hype again, but actually has been around for a really long time. So yeah, just useful to kind of bear that in mind to foundation things. And what I want to kind of start with really is just to provide that sort of basic glossary of terms, I guess, for those who are less familiar with AI and how the different terms sort of intersect. And I'm going to do this with the help of some of my own AI companions. So these sort of AI avatars have all been created by a software called Synthesia. It's free to use, free to sign up to. And the idea is it will kind of use a series of sort of blank models, as it were. You can kind of put the text in and it will actually then create videos based on these models and any voice that you choose, which do sound a little bit robotic. So first of all, here's avatar number one. We'll call her Natalie to tell us a bit about artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, or AI, is the simulation of human intelligence processes by machines or computer systems, which includes mimicking human abilities like learning, decision-making, and communication.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Good co-host. So yeah, really important, I think, when we start talking about AI that, you know, we have got these two terms, artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence, which is largely what I'm going to be kind of talking about today. AI itself, much broader category. You'll have heard stuff about things like general artificial intelligence in the press, which is the idea of creating a system that basically not only learns by itself, but makes decisions by itself, and in theory could overtake human intelligence. That's kind of, some would say, the sci-fi end of it. Others would say we're maybe nearer to that than people think. But yeah, AI and artificial intelligence in general, much kind of broader area. And what we're going to be talking about today is generative artificial intelligence. I'm going to let Joe tell us a little bit about that.
Generative artificial intelligence is a type of technology that uses AI to create content, such as text, image, or video. Trained on large amounts of data, it uses this data to find patterns that help it generate new material based on prompts from a user.
So hopefully that kind of gives a bit of a sense of generative AI, what the kind of difference is there. This is a lot of the kind of systems you'll have read about over the past year or possibly used yourselves. Things like kind of ChatGPT, things like Midjourney for image creation, where you provide a prompt as a user and using kind of this sort of corpus of data that the system has been trained on, it's then kind of creating content based on predictive text. So that's the difference with generative AI. And a lot of the generative AI stuff is built around large language models, which again, you might have kind of read about or seen the acronym LLMs. And I'm going to leave Nadia to tell us about the final sort of glossary of terms, large language models.
Large language models, or LLMs, are AI models that have been trained on a large amount of text, which helps the model to understand and generate human-like text. For example, AI tools such as ChatGPT, Bing, and Bard.
So we're going to come on a little bit later to talk about some of the stuff around kind of data and the training of these sort of systems, what sort of data they've been trained on. But essentially, when we're talking about kind of large language models, as mentioned there in the video, we're talking about some of these tools like ChatGPT, Bing, Bard. So the kind of tools that have been trained on a large body of data and that allows them to basically kind of simulate sort of human-like text or replicate it based on the data that they've been trained on. So those are kind of just three terms, I think, fairly useful to know about to kind of frame the rest of what we're going to be talking about in this session and the next session. But what I have also included on the slides, which I'll make sure we send out, is a link to kind of Coursera's AI glossary, and that's got quite a good selection of different terms that you might hear about, you might read about, often are kind of interconnected, but also kind of quite useful just to know when you're sort of reading about AI itself. And I think sometimes it's useful just to kind of provide that sort of sample, I suppose, of how people are using it, and on a very basic level, what does the software look like as you're using it. So this is just a very short video, which I'll play on screen, of the basic kind of use case of something like ChatGPT, what it looks like, and how the kind of system works based on some of the terms you've just heard around kind of predictive text and these large language models. So what you'll see on the screen in front of you, we're just going to pick a single query. This one, tell me a random fun fact about the Roman Empire. As you can see there, ChatGPT, using the data it's been trained on, which on this kind of free version is up to about January 2022, anything that was on the internet up to that point, and any kind of data it's been trained on, comes out with an answer which seems, pretty kind of common sense, really, or pretty much sort of built on what you might expect if you kind of Googled it. We're now going to follow up. We're going to say, okay, can you do something a bit more creative for me? Here's a poem about the Roman Empire. And again, although slightly generic, it does provide a fairly serviceable kind of poem about the Roman Empire, again, using the data it's been trained on. And now I'm going to ask for it to give me something a little bit different and, tell me what the average Roman looks like. And again, it's going to go through the data it's been trained on, using that predictive text modeling to go, well, what are we likely to want, or what's likely to be the next word or the next kind of token that comes out. And again, gives us a pretty serviceable answer on what the average Roman might have looked like. Now, obviously, it's really important to remember with all of this, as you'll probably have found out if you've used these kinds of systems yourself, that because it's not actually using a brain as such, it's just using predictive text and the data it's been trained on, it can come up with what they sometimes term as hallucinations, or kind of factually incorrect answers, which is one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later on the ethics side of AI. But you can also see that some of the technology that's now been built in is image creation as well. So the kind of DALL-E model is now built into ChatGPT. And you see what I've asked it here is to take that description that it's generated and make an image for me. So actually show me what the average Roman looked like, rather than just tell me. And in a second, what it's going to do is kind of bring out an image, which hopefully fairly swiftly you'll see is potentially a little bit problematic. So again, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on with some of the ethics side of AI, but even though I didn't ask it specifically for a man, you can see that it's kind of defaulted to show me a picture of a man. It's kind of shown perhaps sort of quite typical features that it's taken from the data. And again, it's worth remembering that, you know, as with kind of human beings in general, the data that it's kind of drawing from is going to be as biased as we are as people. And there are some significant issues with that in terms of particularly the image creation software with AI and the types of kind of perhaps more stereotypical images it kind of puts out. So that's just to kind of give a really sort of basic introduction, you know, make sure we're kind of all sort of on the same level in terms of what we're going to be talking about around generative AI, and just a demo of some of the stuff that's being used at the moment in terms of the text creation and also the image creation. And I think before we kind of break down this year, I suppose, this kind of past year and sort of what's developed, it's really worth being aware of just how quickly the AI space is moving. So on screen at the moment, you can see just a selection of some of the different tools, software, apps that are kind of either currently being created or have already been created and released. So you can see sort of on the left-hand side, we've got some kind of more specific tools like Prepper. So Prepper is a interview preparation chatbot that was created by Adzuna. That's trained on their kind of job data, so based on lots of different job descriptions. And what happens is it asks you interview questions based on a job description that you copy and paste, and then it actually gives you feedback on those interview answers. So that's a very kind of specific tool. We've seen other ones as well for things like CV writing, and that's something we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next session. You'll also see some of the stuff that I talked about a second ago, so things like HeyGen, so creating kind of these AI generated avatars. So these could be kind of people that aren't you, or these could be literally your digital twin you record yourself, and then you can basically use this avatar for any video you might want to create. So you can kind of really start to see where these sort of time-saving implications of AI might come in. And we're also seeing stuff that's obviously going to infiltrate most of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So things like Google are bringing AI into their tools, like Google Sheets, for example, Google Docs, Gmail, so that, you know, there will be some sort of AI assistant kind of overseeing a lot of that in the same way that we're seeing with things like Microsoft 365 Copilot, which again is going to be built in to all the Microsoft suite, and indeed, you know, enterprise business users of Microsoft can already access that technology. But we're also seeing a bunch of really specific AI tools as well that are kind of coming out. So Vimeo have created one that's all around video editing, where actually you can kind of change the text on a transcript and it will actually change what's in the video, so the actual footage, which is pretty incredible. We've got things like Guide, which is an AI tool that allows you to basically take a screencast and then it will create a step-by-step guide for you of what you've done without you having to do anything. And we've also got kind of what we call conversational AI bots, so things like HeyPi, which kind of positions itself as almost like a coach, like a personal coach, personal assistant, and also kind of some of the technology now being built into different not even applications, but I guess different products. So the one on the far left, bottom left, is Rabbit. So this was released recently. So it's kind of almost a bit like a very limited smartphone, just with kind of AI built into it. So a bit of like an AI sort of personal desktop assistant type thing. But we are now seeing kind of AI being built into lots of, you know, sort of everyday products, mobile phones, cars, which we'll kind of come to at the end as well. And one thing really to be aware of just in this top right, when we talk about the speed of development with AI, is that OpenAI recently released their GPT store, which essentially allows anyone that uses the paid version of ChatGPT to create their own chatbot and share that and potentially monetize that. So I think moving forward, we're very, very likely to see a huge swathe of new chatbots, very specific use cases being created, being kind of let into the world. And what that will do in the future is, again, anyone's guess. So yeah, lots and lots of high-speed development at the moment, and very, very difficult to keep up, which is why it's useful to not necessarily look at AI from the perspective of, do I need to know everything that's going on, but just to kind of get a good understanding of those sort of foundational things. And of course, for all the kind of positive news about AI, all the amazing developments that are going on, there's also lots of very, very funny stories about how it's failing spectacularly. And you may have seen this one in the press recently. DPD, I don't know if they're everyone's favourite kind of delivery company, but their AI bot actually ended up kind of being, I guess, tricked by a customer into saying that the company were absolutely dreadful, swearing at the customer, all these sort of things. So, you know, there is still a lot of development still to go in the technology, despite the speed at which it's moving. So what I want to do really is kind of just provide a little bit of a breakdown of what's happened over the past year, give you a sense of how things have kind of moved. And before we kind of move on to talk a bit more specifically about the higher education sector, and then sort of what could be coming down the pipeline in the future. So, you know, again, depending on where you kind of started with AI over the last year, you know, maybe that you didn't come to ChatGPT or generative AI software in November 2022. It might have been that you missed the kind of early stage of it, and many people did. But certainly that was kind of when we started to initially see a lot of hype around AI, a lot of hype around ChatGPT. So around kind of November, December 2022, lots of these articles were coming out in news publications around, you know, what is ChatGPT? What does it do? You know, can you trust it? Lots of sort of thought pieces, I guess, kind of really starting to sort of sow the seeds for what we saw through most of 2023, which was speculation about what AI could do in the future. And I think it's, you know, it's one of those things where it now feels quite a long time ago, but actually when it did come out, for those who hadn't really used generative AI before, and I definitely class myself in that category, it really did feel pretty seismic. There's a quote from Arthur C. Clarke, which is, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And I think that was, for a lot of people that were starting to use this technology in November, December 2022, it really did feel like it was going to be big, because it was just doing stuff that, although it was actually fairly basic compared to what it can do now, was really just quite amazing. It felt like you were talking to somebody. It felt like this was a system that could do almost anything. So I think, you know, it's kind of hard to overstate really just how impactful that early period was in the back end of 2022. We then sort of moved kind of into 2023, and this was when really over those kind of first maybe 4 or 5 months of the year, we really started to see the kind of the hype grow for AI. So there were lots and lots of different companies all kind of competing, all kind of dropping updates, all essentially purporting to have the best chatbot or the best type of AI software. So we saw stuff like Midjourney and DALL-E for image creation, sort of competing to see who, you know, which version could kind of make the best images. We saw that kind of battle between Google, between Microsoft and OpenAI, and Amazon in terms of kind of producing chatbots, and also systems like Pi, which is a kind of standalone sort of AI chatbot, but positioned itself a bit more like a careers coach or like a personal coach. So really kind of from that period, from January to May, there was this really big development. New kind of AI sort of apps were dropping all the time. Bit of a kind of an arms race between the companies that were involved in terms of trying to pitch who would have the best AI product and what it could do. So those kind of first few months of 2023, things moved really quickly. There was a lot more buzz around the technology. And we also started to see a kind of a lot more speculation as well about what would actually happen with AI. So there was quite a lot of stuff around, particularly the video technology, lots of concern around things like deep fakes. So could AI be used to kind of create videos of people doing things they hadn't actually done? And indeed, we've already seen stuff like that that could have a serious impact on the general election, US election, Indian election that are happening this year. There's been quite a few videos of prominent politicians that have been completely forged, completely doctored with AI that are incredibly realistic. So it is, you know, it's kind of quite a scary time with that particular type of technology. But even at this point, even in early 2023, we were hearing about this. You know, we were hearing about this is going to change the face of video creation. It's going to change the face of filmmaking. So there was quite a lot of that speculation. You know, we weren't 100% sure what it could do, but we knew it was going to be big. And we also started to see a lot of reports come out from organizations like the World Economic Forum, really kind of positioning AI as the next big thing in terms of jobs. So this kind of World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report put sort of AI machine learning jobs as very much, these will be the fastest growing jobs up to 2030. We saw a lot of reports that were talking about job creation, job displacement. So, AI will replace 30% of jobs by 2030, 40% of jobs. Actually, it'll create more jobs than it takes away. So there were lots of kind of competing reports. And I'm going to talk about one at the end, which I think is really useful to keep an eye on, which looks more at exposure to AI rather than just job displacement, which I think can be a little bit more useful. And then kind of when we move sort of towards the middle to the back end of the year, we did start to see a little bit more from kind of discussion, I guess, towards action. So rather than it just being about, this is what we think AI is going to do, we started to see some more reports like this McKinsey one that you can see on the left, the state of AI in 2023, which was actually kind of detailing what our business is using generative AI for at this point in time. And you can see that they kind of identified not just sort of particular areas of a business where it was being used more commonly, so marketing and sales. Unsurprisingly, because of the amount of kind of communication in there, a text-based AI system is likely to be very useful. But also you can then see that there's areas of the business where it was likely to be less useful. So certainly kind of within the finance sector, we heard that there was a lot of reservation about using it because of the data privacy side of things. And again, depending on what your industry did and how much it needed to use kind of technology to create communications very quickly or to maybe analyze data very quickly, may have had an impact on how likely or unlikely businesses were to use AI. You can see sort of down the bottom of this kind of McKinsey report that they were also starting to identify, specific use cases of how businesses were using AI. So for some of them, it was about, crafting first drafts of documents like blogs, emails, these sorts of things. Very, very easy to do with AI technology. For some of them, it was kind of creating new ideas. So it was sort of using it to kind of brainstorm new ideas. And again, there's, lots of great ways you can use ChatGPT and similar software for that. And for others, it was things like data analysis, predicting trends based on big pools of data. And there was one story towards the end of last year which got quite a lot of people a little bit nervous, which was a secondary school, I think it was a private school, who'd actually hired an AI system as their deputy principal for data. So I think the story was designed really to provoke. But essentially what they'd done is the head or the principal had basically bought this AI system to help them to make decisions, strategic decisions about what to do in the school. So it was never a case they were solely relying on this AI bot, but the idea was it was to help them analyze huge pools of data that they had within the school system, do that securely, and then kind of predict trends that might help them to make decisions as a senior leadership team. So that was quite an interesting one and sort of spoke to some of the stuff around data analysis, prediction that AI can do as well. And we also saw quite a few reports sort of towards the end of last year around the impact or the predicted impact on different levels of work. So perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of the research that was done, particularly in America, showed that executives, C-suite, so CEOs, chief financial officers, etc., were the people who kind of thought, everyone's using AI, everyone understands about AI, it's really important, it's going to take people's jobs away. And actually some of the research found that kind of people in sort of middle management or lower were actually not as fussed with it. Some thought it was a bit more overhyped, some weren't using it as regularly. But there was also research that showed that actually the biggest impact it was going to have on people's jobs in terms of improving what they could do was for people at that kind of lower to mid level of responsibility rather than the top level. So there were lots of kind of competing reports about, how is it going to impact work? Where is it going to impact work? Who's going to be impacted? And those started to become a little bit clearer as we move towards the back end of 2023. We also started to see kind of lots of different people creating AI tools or creating their own AI tools or guides for using AI. So on the left hand side, you can see this is a YouTube video, got a huge amount of interest last year from an Irish careers coach called Paddy Jobsman, not his real name, I don't think. And this was all about writing a CV with ChatGPT. It's actually a really kind of nuanced and very sort of carefully put together video. But stuff like this really became quite prevalent over the last year or towards the back end of last year. People sort of saying, here is your go-to guide if you want to use AI for this purpose. And this is just kind of one example. And we also started to see a lot of kind of companies, in all sorts of industries starting to build AI into their products. So the example on the right-hand side is from Moresby. They're an ed tech, so an education technology provider, and they've actually started building into their systems an AI kind of chatbot called Huxby, which is trained on all of their data for the schools that they work with to be able to use to access information quicker and on a 24/7 basis. So again, we started to see towards that back end of 2023, more sort of practical tools, use cases, and that was also true from OpenAI as well. So quite a lot of the companies involved in producing AI would actually also share what's the best way to use our technology. So we started to see the creation of these sort of prompt libraries. If you're using ChatGPT, a bit like the example I showed earlier, with the kind of the description of a Roman, are there better ways that you could actually put that prompt together to get a more accurate response, to get a more specific response? And you can now access all of these type of tools online as well. And so, as I say, that kind of really led us to the position that we're in now, where we're in this kind of very saturated marketplace. There's huge amount of AI products out there, all kind of purporting to offer different things, all kind of purporting to offer solutions that can really help you. And part of what we'll talk about in the next session is very much around, how people might make decisions about what problems they need to solve and what solutions AI could provide. But I guess really sort of towards the back end of the year, one of the big things that we saw a lot more of was the question of ethics. There was a lot more conversation about what does kind of ethics look like when using AI. Some of this was kind of at a more local level, so within particular teams, particular organisations, but we also saw some kind of quite big ticket stuff. So in November, there was the AI Safety Summit in the UK at Bletchley Park. And that was kind of hosted by the UK, but there's now going to be a series of these summits taking place across the world in future years. I think France are holding the next one. And quite a few different things agreed. So kind of agreements in principle for a set of guidelines around regulating AI as governments, the setting up of the AI Safety Institute in the UK. So actually kind of having a body that kind of focuses on this particular aspect of AI, but also sort of they've kind of set to task the State of the Science report, which has kind of been set by this AI safety steering group, I guess, to actually research into the science behind it, how safe it is, particularly from the data kind of privacy side. So that's kind of something that's been going on. And then in addition, we've sort of seen things like the AI Act from the EU. So the European Union have kind of set up in principle this AI Act, which is all about the regulation of artificial intelligence. So it's still yet to be approved by the European Parliament and probably wouldn't come in until 2025, I think, at the earliest. But the idea with this is they've started to set out for companies what would be kind of acceptable or deemed unacceptable uses of AI. So particularly thinking about things like predictive policing. So using facial recognition to try and predict, where people are going to be or what sort of crimes people might commit, which all sounds very kind of sci-fi, but also sort of things that might impinge on people's privacy, and things that maybe have biases built into the technology already that we have to be quite careful with. So the EU are already starting to set their stall out, and obviously other governments around the world are starting to position their own AI acts as well. So the UK, the US. Obviously, there's kind of potential conflict there because, will governments agree? Will what the US want and China want be the same, for example? There's still a lot to kind of be worked out there, but we're certainly seeing a shift towards there being more kind of formal formal discussion, I guess, around ethics in AI. And actually, we're seeing this on a more kind of local level as well. So on the right-hand side, you can see this is a guide that's recently been put out, for the public sector and for the civil service, on a guide to kind of using artificial intelligence for public sector projects. So this is quite interesting because, again, it's sort of covering if you're using AI as part of a procurement project for the government, or as part of the work you're doing to support the public, what are the things you need to take into consideration? And that includes things like fairness, accessibility in terms of the cost of AI systems, accessibility in terms of whether it works for kind of all parties, whether people have got the requisite digital skills to kind of understand how to use it, but also in terms of things like is the data protected? Is it ethical? Are there biases built into the systems that could disadvantage particular groups? So there's a lot of that work going on now and formalising that work around ethics. And we're also seeing kind of ethics come up quite a lot more generally in relation to AI. So you may have seen over the past year lots of kind of lawsuits or kind of court cases being opened up against AI companies. So there have been ones against image creation software from artists, graphic designers. We had some quite high profile authors suing OpenAI around, again, copyright infringement. And then the most recent one is the New York Times, who again have kind of sued OpenAI and Microsoft for basically, they claim, using the data from their articles, because obviously that's all accessible on the internet, and actually using that to kind of create content that typically these kind of news publications would create. So that is kind of still very much sort of in the balance as far as I'm aware, but from what we've kind of seen so far, there haven't been any kind of conclusive wins or losses for these AI companies. But the copyright infringement side of things is a really, really big area to kind of look out for. We're also hearing quite a lot about obviously energy use. So the amount of energy needed to power AI systems is absolutely huge. This headline is quite eye-catching, the one down the bottom of the screen. AI industry could use as much energy as the Netherlands, but even Sam Altman, the chief executive of OpenAI, has said that the staggering amounts of energy needed means that probably we're going to need different sources of energy just to power the technology that's needed to work these AI systems. There's quite an interesting quote about using ChatGPT and saying ChatGPT, asking it a really basic question like, describe a member of the Roman Empire, is a bit like asking a Lamborghini to deliver a pizza. You're asking a very, very high-end system that uses a lot of energy to do something that's actually kind of quite basic. So there may be kind of questions moving forward ethically about when do we use AI and for what purposes, given the environmental impact it might have. And then I think the final thing when we kind of come to ethics is really sort of talking about actually on a sort of existential level, why do we use AI? Where do we use it? How do we use it? And for what purpose? So there's a really great talk, which I've included a link to on these slides, from Dr. Nima Pasha at the Employability Lab 2023 event, which took place in November. And Nima kind of talks about, this idea that, yes, there's a lot of kind of ethical concerns around bias, around data privacy, all these sorts of things. But there's also stuff in there around actually social isolation. And if we get sort of too hung up on the idea of using chatbots for everything, are we kind of distancing ourselves from human contact? Are we making it a bit of a crutch that we kind of fall back on? So one of kind of Nima's quotes here, which I think is really nice, is that ethical use of AI is enabling humans to stay in human roles, but with AI support. So moving to that kind of AI as co-pilot model, but also sort of embracing the fact that any AI systems are going to be as biased and as wrong as humans are, and they could be as kind and empathetic as humans are, but a lot of that does depend on us, because ultimately these systems are trained on data that we've provided. So kind of moving ahead, we're going to kind of come back to this in a second, but this is a picture again generated by AI that perhaps gives you a sense of just how complex the future could look. There's so many potential applications for the technology, some of which we're going to talk about a little bit later, some in the next session. And I think it's really worth kind of bearing in mind the fact that actually there's a lot that's unknown at the moment. There's a lot of speculation out there about, how impactful AI is going to be. Is it overhyped? Is it not overhyped? Will it actually take longer to be prevalent in everyday life than we think? But certainly kind of at the moment, it's very, very hard to predict from 2024 onwards exactly what the future with AI would look like. But we're going to kind of pull things back a little bit there. I'm going to start, Julie, just by seeing if we've got any questions in the chat to pick up about what we've talked about so far. And then we're going to move on to talk a bit about the HE sector. And I'm going to bring Steve in to share his insights.
Yep, so we've got lots of comments and questions, so I'll just go through them. So the first one was about just saying that hallucination was the just doing it, I've lost it. 1 second. Where am I? There's just so many in there. Yeah, so that was it. Josie Ellis said that hallucinate was a Cambridge Dictionary Word of the Year 2023 just because of AI. And then we had a bit of a discussion about whether sort of you can tell between what's copyrighted and what's open access. And then I think Steve Bentley explained about the fact that you can't tell and the different lawsuits and that sort of thing. Yeah, and like the fact that people had taken them to court. And there was a question about how the money's made with the different tools. So obviously some of them are free and some of them you have to pay. So
I think that's just. Oh, sorry, Jill. I was going to say, just on that point, I think it's a really good point. Again, kind of coming back to the ethical question, because one of the things I think we're particularly worried about, probably from a careers service perspective, it's fair to say, is that digital poverty angle. That like ultimately, if some of these tools, and majority now have got a free version and a paid version, and lots moving towards a paid version, that ultimately, if the most useful aspect of these tools is the paid part, and you can't afford that, are you potentially going to be kind of further down than your peers when it comes to your career and your career development, because you can't access these? So I think it's such an important point. And sorry, Julie, you said Steve had something to kind of add to that as well.
Yeah, but I think that's an interesting point, because I know some of our tools, like in careers, because we provide free access for students, it sort of levels up things if some of them wouldn't have otherwise have access. Anyway, so Steve said about the fact that some of them are integrated into different products, and then they, like Microsoft will pay for the license to integrate different things. And then we had a very interesting conversation about people using AI for job applications. And so I think, is it Steve? There's a whole load of discussion going on here. I'm trying to see who said what, but I think it said that Steve said that a lot of the covering letters from the placement students that they got recently were generated with AI, and Josie said that she actually had some people a bit further down who were using it I'm just trying to get my head around this. Somebody used it to do an interview test.
Yeah.
I don't know how that's possible. Oh no, is it? Yeah, it's different people having discussions. I think Debbie Hall said something as well about people using it, and so it's obviously quite widespread.
I will dip in there and attempt to respond to some of those when we move on to the next section. Thanks, Julie. I think the interview test thing is interesting, and I guess you could Prepper, the Adzuna tool, kind of does that. It's in the sense that, a bit like ChatGPT, if you set up a chatbot to respond to a series of prompts, you can in fact use it to essentially simulate an interview. Obviously the video ones that exist already do that for you, again depending on whether you can afford them or whether you've got access to them. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. We'll come back to the questions because I don't want to kind of keep Steve waiting, but thanks, Julie, I really appreciate that. What we're going to kind of come to move on to now really is focus a little bit more specifically on the higher education sector. And again, if you've kind of been following the news or just news across the sector, you'll have seen that there's a huge amount of chat going on about the use of AI within education more generally, but particularly across higher education. We've got stuff as kind of recent as what Loughborough University are doing, so using kind of hologram lecturers to kind of bring in guest speakers, and a little bit like I showed you earlier with those videos on Synthesia, the possibility of being able to actually kind of create videos where it's not actually the individual person speaking, but it's kind of like a digital avatar of them that they've pre-programmed. So lots of interesting kind of chat going on there. But also we're sort of seeing lots of reports across the sector at the moment about how students are using AI or not using AI. We're hearing about how different services are using it. So for example, the University of Cambridge comms team got a very public facing statement about how they use AI for their work, when they might use it, and again that transparency so that people working with them know what might be generated by AI, what might not be. So huge amount of kind of talk, huge amount of work going on in the sector as a whole. And what I want to do now is kind of defer to Steve to talk a little bit more about kind of what's happening specifically in the University of Huddersfield.
Great, thanks, Chris. Do you want to stop sharing and I'll share it from my end so I can control it?
That's fine. Yeah, we don't want a Chris Whitty. We've had enough.
Yes, we'll. Absolutely. Great. Okay, so as a university then, we have been doing quite a bit of work on this, as you'd expect, since kind of the end of last year when this all kind of kicked off with ChatGPT becoming more widely available, although as Chris has said, it's been available for a long time. It's just become more widely usable. And the general principle is that we don't think this is going to go anywhere. It's here to stay, and we need to adapt to it. So some of our colleagues at other universities tried to say we're going to ban it for students. That's just not going to work. So we are basically going to try and embrace it as much as we can. And really, we think that becoming AI literate is going to be one of our graduate attributes going forward, something that our graduates are going to need to be prepared for the world of work. So set up a steering group with people like Chris are on and other colleagues who are here today to really try and work out how the university goes forward with this. Academic misconduct obviously is one of the biggest concerns we've got around students using AI to complete work and hand it in for credit. And our general view really is that the best way to address that is via the way that you design your assessment. So designing an assessment that AI couldn't easily produce the results for. And I know there's been a lot of talk about moving into exams rather than essays and things. We think that's probably a bit of a backward move, particularly with the work I've been doing recently around differential attainment and the exams and the issue that they have. So we think that that assessment design is the way forward, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We have created a set of standard statements to go into assessment, so students have got a really clear idea of what they can and can't do with AI, and I would encourage colleagues to make sure you are using those. And we are ready to react as things progress. It's already, things have changed a long way in the last 12 months, so we are ready to react and be agile on this as we need to be. And we set all of this up, and then the QAA came out with a set of guidance, and we're really pleased to say that what we've produced really aligns quite well with what the QAA is recommending for the sector. So I think we are ahead of the curve. We updated the regulations last year. Now, actually, what it always said was, in terms of the academic misconduct regulations, was it's your responsibility to ensure that the work you present for credit is your own. And that kind of covered us, but we've gone in a little bit further. And we've now acknowledged that that does apply to also work that's being produced by software rather than humans. We haven't spoken about AI specifically because the way this is going is that AI tools are getting integrated with all sorts of other things, and it's not always labeled as being AI. So to give you an example, if you go onto Word Online, the Word on the web, click on the Editor tab, and you've got a button that says Summarize, and that will create a summary of your document. It's using GPT in the background, but it doesn't tell you that. So students could quite easily fall into the trap of using an AI tool and not realizing that they have done. So we've kind of just nudged away from talking about AI here, and we're talking in more general terms that we can be more applicable as things progress. We have also put something in here specifically about AI and the various different sides of events it could help you to commit in terms of plagiarism, contract cheating, and fabrication. So we have got that more explicitly in regulations, although we think that what we had previously did actually cover all of this quite nicely anyway. So to support colleagues and our students, we've got two sets of guidelines. We've got one for students and one for staff. And the ones for students, we've got a set of principles I'll show you in a second. We've got a link to those updated assessment regulations and also the library referencing guide that's been produced to help students to reference ChatGPT and the like, the output from that in their work. Staff ones, we've got a lot of talk about changing the assessments to be less vulnerable to AI. Those descriptors I mentioned and various other resources on there. There's also quite a big section there about Turnitin as well. And I'll put the links to those into the chat once I finish presenting. So principals for students, and Amanda, who's here today, had a big hand in producing these. We've got 6 principles, and you can go into a bit more detail here, but it's really talking about how it's just another tool that you can use if it's appropriate. You do need to be careful that the output could be biased, it could be hallucinated. Quite a bit about the academic misconduct side of things and about how to become AI literate. So that's the kind of principle for students. There's also a staff version which is fairly similar, but does have a lot more about data protection in there. In terms of students, we've got some material within the academic integrity module that all students need to do. Thanks, Amanda. So we've got a little scenario here that we present to students about AI and ask them to reflect on some statements about whether these comments are correct or not. For staff then, we've got 2 lots of principles. We've got some general principles around using AI in your everyday work. And again, those are the ones that are quite similar to the student ones, but with a bit more emphasis on data protection and copyright. And we've got the ones about embracing AI. So this is about how to use it as part of your teaching. And this covers things like Chris was saying about digital poverty and students not necessarily having access to tools. That perhaps is less of a concern than it was when we wrote these, because we've now got the Copilot from Microsoft, which is Microsoft have licensed ChatGPT 4, put it into Bing, and you can now use that with your university account, and that's available to staff and students. So you do now have access to that paid version through the corporate university license. That does take away a lot of those concerns. And also students doing things like design courses will have access to things in the Adobe Suite as well. So quite a few things out there. We have come up with a set of descriptors, and we're hoping that people are going to put one of these on every piece of work so students know exactly where they stand. So level 1, we're saying no AI permitted at all. And that is slightly problematic. I'll come back to that in a second. Level 2, we're saying some use permitted, and we start with an idea of you can use it in the early stages of your research, but everything you submit must be your own. Then we've got level 3, where we're saying it's integrated, we are embracing AI. AI is part of the learning outcomes here. We want to assess you on how well you use AI, kind of thing. And you have got this option to add some more detail to that. So if someone wants to go somewhere between the two and say, well, you can use it if you want, but I'm not requiring it, you can use level 2 and put some detail in there. Our guidance is that level 2 should be the default, because how are you going to enforce level 1? So we think level 2 is really going to be the default, but I know a lot of people have used level 1 so far, but we are trying to encourage people that level 2 really ought to be the default there. In terms of detecting whether students have used this stuff, we have got the Turnitin detection tool. This is really controversial. When this came out, a lot of universities didn't want to go anywhere near it. We were one of a handful that did. We wanted to basically evaluate it for ourselves before we decided it was useless. And it does generate a lot of false positives. We know that from empirical testing of it. It's not so great at detecting things. You get false positives, you get false negatives. So the jury really is out about on the value of this. It doesn't show it's working. There's a real lack of transparency. All it says is this is generated by AI, which isn't really enough to put in front of an academic misconduct panel. It's really just a prompt to say there might be a problem here, go and find some more evidence. There has been some suggestion that it can wrongly detect work from people who are not English writers as their first language. Turnitin themselves say that they've empirically proven that to be wrong. You can have a look at their study and decide what you believe yourself on that one. There are also other cans of worms that this has opened with things like Grammarly and other writing tools, and whether actually what they produce, whether it's AI or not, whether or not that's actually acceptable or not. And so as a result, we've gone back to the university proofreading policy, and there's a revision of that going to UTLC next week. So look out for an update on that. So Turnitin always will be playing catch up as these new tools emerge. So the Turnitin tool that's out there at the moment was trained on 3.5 ChatGPT. Yeah, it doesn't do so well with other tools. So this is a big limitation of it. And for those reasons and several others, it will never be a complete solution. I'll just pause to take a couple of these questions in the chat. So around whether you can use AI to generate AI itself. If you were to put something into ChatGPT and say, did you create this? It will lie, it won't know. But these tools that are out there specifically to do that claim to do so. Have we had successful academic misconduct cases on AI? Yes, we have. One of the biggest kind of smoking guns is that the references on things are made up. So frequently things like ChatGPT will give you something, it'll give you a reference list, and half of the items on there just don't exist. So if you find that, you can pretty much corroborate that it is AI. Although technically that's a separate offence of fabrication in its own right. But yeah, that having additional evidence like that can be very useful. And there have been occasions where people left things in where it says, I'm an AI bot, I can't answer that. It's part of what they've handed in. So some students have managed to incriminate themselves in that way. I don't think that's happened here, but I've heard of that happening elsewhere. To give you an example of the limitations of the Turnitin tool, you've got, this is what it looks like really. You've got sections of the text that have been highlighted as being generated by AI. This is the university's academic misconduct policy, and Turnitin says it's 100% AI. It was written 4 years ago. So you can see from there why we've got some concerns about how accurate this thing is. So as I say, our general thought is that designing out AI or opportunities to use AI is the best way forward. And that really means essays are quite vulnerable. So using other things that are not written essays, like presentations, observations of skills, role-play debates, are a good way forward. Personalization can be really powerful in this. So setting an assignment where a student is reflecting on some experience that they've had in a face-to-face class, for example, that some AI wouldn't know anything about. The big one is requiring evidence of the process. Assess the process, not the end product. So you've got that kind of development process as part of it. And things like Vibers can be a good way of doing that as an alternative to presentations. And if you don't want to design it out, you've kind of got to design it in and create an assignment that you expect students to use AI to complete. So I will hand back to Chris at that point.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, a good kind of point to end on there. One thing we'll talk about a little bit more in the next session is kind of, again, how sort of AI is impacting the recruitment sector. And we've heard a little bit of that in the chat around perhaps how kind of students are using it in terms of interview prep, applications, cover letters, etc. But of course, actually, what's happening sort of in industry is that we're hearing a lot of employers having to shift the way that they're actually recruiting to kind of account for this in a way. So using sort of different approaches. And there's certainly a big move amongst larger employers to move towards more skills-based hiring, where perhaps the way that candidates will be assessed is going to be something that can't really be replicated at every stage by AI, or can't be supported at every stage by AI, so that they're able to kind of really get a proper assessment of where the candidates are at. But actually, it's very similar to kind of what we're feeding back to students within the careers service, that ultimately, as you said, it's about process. Yes, AI can kind of produce a pretty serviceable CV with the right prompting, serviceable cover letter applications, those sort of things. But actually, if you don't really understand the purpose of why you're putting those documents together, at some point in a recruitment process, you're going to come unstuck, whether it's the early stage or whether it's kind of much later. So I think that kind of criticality about actually how you use it, why you use it, where, when, and for what purpose, it is applicable across so many sort of different scenarios. So I'm going to move back. We're going to move to sort of the final part of the session. Again, if you've got any questions, do feel free to kind of keep them coming in the chat. And Julie, do feel free to interrupt me if there's anything that I've kind of missed coming through from people. So we wanted to kind of finish really with looking at sort of what's next, or what might be kind of coming down the pipeline in relation to generative AI, and leading a little bit into the next session we'll be running on the 15th of Feb. So I think what's kind of useful really is to be aware that there are some emerging trends we're starting to see, although obviously kind of referring back to my previous point, a lot of speculation still out there, and very, very difficult to say for certain exactly what the direction of travel will be, but certainly some emerging trends we're kind of seeing appearing across business, and in terms of kind of how these tools are being created or being integrated into kind of the technology we use generally. So I think the first trend that's really worth talking about is, AI feeling a little bit more like a normal part of our day-to-day lives. So we've talked about stuff like Microsoft Copilot. We've talked about kind of that AI software being integrated maybe into apps that we already use, like Grammarly. It's kind of been there for a while. It's quite kind of present now in things like Duolingo. If you use the Duolingo app, they've now really integrated AI into that, and to kind of add to the gamification element, and also to add to the learning personalization side of things. So I think it's really going to start feeling like you'll hear AI more as kind of like a common technology that's built into lots of different things. And I'll give a couple of examples of that in a second, of stuff that's really kind of being advertised quite widely at the moment, where things like ChatGPT are sort of being normalized as being built into this technology. The second thing I think we'll see a lot more of is again around ethics and governance. So we've talked a little bit about sort of where that's going at the moment with the EU Act, with the AI Safety Summit. But I think what we're now seeing from a lot of organisations is quite public statements about ethics and governance, how they're using AI within their businesses and what that looks like. So I think we'll start to potentially see a little bit more call for transparency about how companies are using AI, particularly within things like recruitment, because there's a lot of kind of evidence of particularly kind of video AI software and potential biases that are built into those. So I suspect we'll kind of see companies being expected to be a bit more transparent about how they're using AI. Certainly kind of the government, public sector, will have a lot of kind of internal regulations around that and how they kind of present that. And I think sort of the third thing, which kind of leads really nicely on to the next session we're going to do, is perhaps a movement away from a lot of this speculation around will AI take my job, which is quite basic, quite reductive, and more towards how is it going to kind of impact my work? How will it sort of intersect with what I'm doing, and how exposed will my kind of job be to AI? And I'll come to a survey in a second that's quite interesting to read on that sort of note. What we're also starting to see is a lot more around, I guess, the positive applications of AI. So there are a number of things, like we said, about the deep fake video technology that are definitely worth worrying about, could have a serious impact on things like our politics, for example. But there's also some really good news stories out there. So The Week had a story published just about, I think maybe a fortnight ago, and it was all about sort of 8 good news stories about AI. And this included things like using AI systems to predict when solar storms are coming, which can give just about enough time to prevent massive damage that might otherwise occur. So it doesn't necessarily mean you stop the damage altogether from, say, electrical storms, but it allows you to maybe shut down the things you need to shut down, stop the more kind of catastrophic electrical damage. And so even like those sort of things where the AI systems can predict or forecast the data much quicker and much better or more accurately than a human can, are really kind of positive. And we've seen the same in things like healthcare as well. So using kind of AI to be able to predict things like early blindness in infants, to predict particular health conditions based on reading scans, and doing that at a much higher accuracy level than a human. So it's worth noting with all of these that they're never talking about AI completely replacing the person's job. It's very much about AI with, rather than AI instead of. So I think we'll hear a lot more about that type of thing, and that's certainly going to be the focus of kind of what we talk about next time around. As I say, lots of kind of day-to-day technology items are going to start implementing AI really as kind of par for the course. So, for example, VW, a lot of their new cars have got ChatGPT built into the kind of the sat nav, the dashboard, so you can kind of ask it questions, voice activated, but actually connected to ChatGPT to give you those kind of real-time answers. You've got phones like Samsung, so the new Samsung phones all have kind of AI built into them, and all of the phone models are going in the same direction. So that kind of sense of the technology being a bit more of a constant in life, I think is going to continue. And in the bottom right, you can see Microsoft Copilot. Again, we kind of talked about that a little bit, that integration of technology, where if you're doing something like producing a PowerPoint, you'll be able to draw on any documents that you've created, create PowerPoint slides based on the notes from that document, and kind of integrate sort of a bit more seamlessly between the different applications, I guess, from Microsoft, but also to speed up things that previously might have taken much longer. So rather than, for example, having to use formulas in Excel, it'll be a case of typing or asking the system to create the data analysis that you need and be able to do that much quicker. So some of these kind of tasks that maybe were more administrative, took us a little bit longer to do, there's the potential of those being really sped up. And again, that's something we're going to talk about in a bit more detail in the next session. And again, just to kind of refer people back to the GPT store, I think this has got the potential to be a really, really big development. So at the moment, only people using the paid version of ChatGPT can access the GPT store, which is where you can create your own chatbot. You can train it on any data you want. So I've created one, for example, that's trained on a document that I wrote, which is all about what do I need to know for a careers appointment. And you can actually kind of train these very specifically on a certain set of data to get the results that you want. We've seen ones out there that people have created which provide answers to questions on dating apps. So if somebody's kind of sending you a message on a dating app, it automates a response. So like there's been some really kind of quite strange and specific use cases. And I think as OpenAI start to make the GPT store accessible for people on the free version, so you can pay to use these apps like you would from the App Store, I think we'll start to see a massive explosion in this idea of kind of individual, very specific use case chatbots created through this type of technology. So that's a big thing to look out for kind of in the year ahead. And I think, again, it's just kind of worth being aware of, the way that sort of the debate's changing around AI intersecting with work. I think we are seeing this move away from these kind of big ticket reports. AI will take 40% of all jobs, 50% of all jobs, this sort of thing, create 300,000 new jobs. And we're seeing a bit more of a move towards actually some kind of context within there and a bit more kind of nuanced discussion. So there's a report on the right, left-hand side, of the screen from MIT, talking about actually just how much it's going to cost companies to replace jobs with AI. And actually a lot of the findings from MIT sort of suggest that, except for maybe a few specific cases, it's going to take a number of years before it becomes cost effective to actually build in all this technology, all the training that's required that would actually replace a human job. And actually in many cases it doesn't actually make sense because of the amount of kind of upfront cost you'd have to put into it versus actually the efficiency gains that you'd make. So there's quite a lot of these reports coming out now challenging some of the sort of dominant narrative about will AI take my job. And the report on the right is a really interesting one actually that I'd highly recommend reading. Again, I've popped the link in the slides that I'll send out to everybody, but this is from the Unit for Future Skills, Department for Education, and it's called Impact of AI on UK Jobs and Training. And it kind of bucks the trend against some of the other reports by talking about occupations exposed to AI rather than will your job be replaced. So it's very much about, what percentage of your job role could be exposed to AI. And all that might mean is, that percentage of your job, you could use AI to support the work that you're doing for that particular task. So if, for example, you work in marketing and comms and you're kind of putting together press releases, marketing materials, all these sorts of things, AI could absolutely support with that. Does that mean that you'd have to use it? Absolutely not, but the exposure to it is still there. And so what's quite interesting about this is compared to some of the other reports, if you look at the type of jobs that are most exposed, they actually tend to be a lot of those kind of professional level, graduate level jobs that for some of the early reports, people were saying, well, these ones won't be touched by AI. It will all be kind of data entry and all these type of roles. But actually, when we talk about exposure, we can see that actually the kind of a lot of different roles are exposed to AI in different ways. Some of them roles that you wouldn't expect, like psychologists, teachers, for example. And again, the kind of key point here is not that these jobs are at risk of being taken by AI, but they're exposed to AI. It means that at some point, we're going to have to think about how we do these jobs in conjunction with AI. So I think this is a big trend to keep a lookout for, is that sort of conversation around how are jobs exposed to AI, and that's what we're going to cover a bit more in the next session, rather than necessarily will those sort of jobs be taken away. And that leads us kind of really nicely on to the next session. So this is going to be taking place on the 15th of Feb, same time, from 3 till 4:30. QR code on the screen. I'll pop this back up at the end of the session if people want to have a look. If you're not able to attend in person, we will be recording this one as well. And what we're going to be doing in this session is kind of moving on to really sort of focus on those sort of more practical use cases around how are different sort of functions across businesses using AI currently to sort of enhance their work, whether that's productivity, whether that's actually creating new products or creating new ideas they couldn't create before AI. What does that look like in practice? And what are some of the things that we kind of need to take into consideration kind of critically in terms of when, where, how we use this technology, if it's the right thing to do? And actually, what are some of the principles that should govern that? And we'll kind of come back again to the AI principles for the university and how that's kind of governing how some of the other teams across the university are starting to use AI to enhance their work as well. And we'll talk specifically about that from the careers service perspective as well. So that's the next session kind of coming up. Before we finish, I've got a couple of just quick mentees I'd like people to fill, if that's okay. But before we kind of get to that, to the takeaways, I guess, from today's session, I just want to see if we've got any other questions, Julie, in the chat to pick up about anything that's been covered so far, before we kind of move on to that final section.
Yeah, so I've got a few of them. So I think this one's from Laura's said about a new tool that's for artists and designers to protect the work and avoid it being scraped into an AI training set without the consent. So links there. And I think then Amanda said about the fact that we've had a discussion about if you're logged into the Copilot, are you protected? Is your data protected? And there's a bit of a uncertainty around this. Some people have said yes because it's within the Microsoft suites. Other people are not so sure. So the university advice is not to put anything sort of confidential or personal into it at the moment until it's been looked at in a bit more detail. Something about, so Andrew Ramesh said, does AI create images that are under copyright? And we've had a bit of a discussion about that, about the made of fragments. So similarly to, the actual writing, it's hard to tell like where they've come from.
It's really, that particular point is really interesting because a couple of kind of anecdotal examples to sort of share there. So I think I've kind of put in the chat, but there was a court case last year, which I think was 3 designers who took Midjourney, the image creation software, to court, and they said, look, you've basically profited off these designs that we've created. And the main reason that they weren't able to claim copyright was that they hadn't actually copyrighted the images before the court case. So that was kind of an oversight on their part. But also, again, part of the problem was exactly what you've just mentioned, the fragments side of things. Now, I've actually seen an example in real life from a friend who's a graphic designer who found a company had replicated his design so closely, and unfortunately his was copyrighted, that he was absolutely convinced it had to have been AI scraping, because he thought no company who knew the industry, which is quite a small industry in terms of this particular type of content creation, no company would knowingly have basically pilfered that work so badly. So that was kind of his feeling. Very anecdotal though. And I think the thing about the artist is very interesting, because that's kind of part of the challenge at the moment. is, how do we tell how much of it is copyrighted, which part, who gets paid, who gets credited? Will there be some sort of agreement like we see with PRS, with royalties, like with the ALCS with writing? Will there be some sort of agreement that, if your work is somehow found to have appeared anywhere in an AI search, would you be able to get royalties for it? Lot to be worked out there. And we're actually seeing companies, again, I've kind of popped this in the chat, starting to almost jump the gun and go, I know my data is going to be stolen, so I might as well work with these companies. So Shutterstock, who are the company do lots of stock footage, photographs, these sorts of things, are already now working with AI. They OpenAI. They have a partnership. They've kind of said, look, you can use all of our library of photos. In return, we want access to all your tools. We want money, obviously, and we want to make sure that that's protected so that only your systems are using that technology. So it's really interesting to see where that's kind of going. Sorry, Julie, any other questions?
No, I was just reading through the comments because some more have appeared about what's this quote from Steve? AI won't take your job, but someone who knows how to use AI might, which is one that we've heard a lot. Yeah, and then I'm just reading one from Jeffrey Miller. Sorry, they just keep coming. It's great though. So could it be the race to the bottom because we don't need to learn anything anymore?
That is exactly what was kind of coming through in Nima Pasha's ethics talk that I was referring to earlier. It was very much this idea of, are we actually being critical about deciding when and where to use it? And just because it's there, should we use it? And I think there's definite implications for kind of education, particularly. Lots of conversations going on about that at the moment. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. Anything else, Julian? If not, I'll move on to the...
I think that's everything. Please shout up anyone if I've missed anything there.
Wonderful. So I'm just going to come to two final Mentimeters, if that's okay with everyone. So two kind of key things I'd just like people to fill in if you don't mind. So it's going to be the same kind of code as before. I'm just going to bring these up on screen, and it's just to capture a little bit of informal feedback that we can kind of take from the session, if that's okay. I've lost it. 1 second. Oh, some people are already on this. Look at this. Well prepared. So yeah, you should see on screen in a second. Again, Mentimeter appearing. Ideally, if you can just kind of share one word that you'd use to describe today's session, that would be really useful. We will be sending out a kind of proper pod evaluation form after the session, which again, really useful if you've got time to fill that in. But just interested to kind of get a bit of a snapshot of one word you'd use to describe today's session. And then I've got one more Menti after that I'd like to come to, which is just some takeaways, just to get a sense of what people might do with some of the information that we've talked about today and some of the kind of conversations that we've sort of had in the chat. Just while we're doing that, Julie, anything else come through? Any questions we haven't picked up so far, just as we kind of move towards the end of the session? Sorry, Julie, I don't know if you can hear me. Any final questions?
Sorry, I was on mute. So
no, it's fine.
I think we've answered everything, unless I've missed something somewhere.
No, that's fantastic. So yeah, thanks for everyone who's kind of sharing on the Menti so far. And again, if you can't use the Menti, feel free to kind of pop it in the chat. Interesting, yeah, sort of mix of kind of feedback, really. I think I'm not surprised at all to kind of see, disheartening in there. I think for a lot of people, worrying, this is kind of a really fast moving scenario where you can see just from kind of what we've talked about today, some of the potentially negative implications. And I think a lot of the concerns that people have are that this is moving so quickly that they worry that the ethics won't be able to keep up with it. Good example is I read somebody who'd been involved in Google talking about when the internet first started, the time to regulate it was early. When social media first came in, the time to regulate was early. And basically on both occasions, their kind of perspective was that opportunity was missed. And a lot of the problems they said, particularly with social media, is the fact that because we didn't maybe put enough expectations or responsibilities on the social media companies early, we kind of now got to the situation where there's so much stuff around kind of fake news, cyberbullying, and not really being able to hold people to account. And they worry that the same thing will kind of happen with AI, that the boat's been missed there. So it's that there are some real concerns, but also nice to sort of people saying, yeah, you've got a bit of information out of it, some stuff hopefully that you didn't know before. and that hopefully it's kind of given you some things to go away and think about. So thank you for those who've kind of filled that in. And finally, just the last one really is, if you wouldn't mind sharing kind of one thing that maybe you'll take away from today's session. So one specific thing that you think, based on what we've kind of talked about today, you'll perhaps take away and apply to whatever work you're doing across the university, or just more generally to your own thinking. So I'll give people a little bit longer for this one, just a couple of minutes, and would really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and any insights you have. Yeah, I love that first response already. This is one that I use a lot when I talk about AI. It's complex. There aren't easy answers. It sounds a bit like sitting on the fence, but it's absolutely spot on. I think if anybody tells you they've got it absolutely cracked, their understanding of AI, how it's going to impact the world, yeah, I think, you know, they're fooling themselves, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, really interesting. Not being afraid to test out the tools. Yeah, I would completely agree. I think one of the big things that we've kind of talked about in our team has very much been, you know, you have to practice with this stuff. You have to try it to understand, will it be useful for your role? Will it not be useful? This is the big thing we're going to talk about next time, is really what's the problem you're trying to solve and how could AI help you solve it, or maybe not. Yeah, GPT Store, I think this is going to be a really interesting development. I'm just experimenting with it at the moment, but again, part of the problem is it's for paid GPT users. That in itself is very much an issue. And yeah, I think I'm really pleased if it has helped you to feel like you're not sticking your head in the sand. That's great, because I think that's one of the big challenges we saw in 2023 is a lot of people, certainly in our sector, were very much kind of, I don't want to touch this just yet, I don't know enough about it. But actually getting a good baseline knowledge of AI, I think, is really important for then being critical about it. And as you say, yeah, it's going to be there, it's going to exist, so you need to find a kind of way to work with it. So that unavoidability, I think, is really important to mention. Yeah, lots of people talking about getting the confidence to sign up, AI not going away, so that's great. And yeah, I think this is actually a really important comment here about you know, when AI can be productive and when it isn't. And I think one of the things even now with AI that there's not always a lot of recognition is that you still need quite good domain knowledge to fact check it. So, you know, even if you're using it for a purpose that actually speeds up productivity for you, like, for example, writing a blog that you would have written anyway, ultimately you're going to have to fact check it for accuracy, because these systems are not foolproof. And to do that with a lot of work and a lot of products that you might create, or a lot of content you might create, you have to have domain knowledge. You can't challenge it, you can't interrogate it unless you know what you're talking about. So I think that's a really, really important point about kind of, you know, it not being a shortcut, you needing to have that knowledge as well. Yeah, encouraging human interaction instead of just the easy option. Yeah, I think that's going to be really important kind of moving forward. And I think, yeah, hopefully, as I say, some of these kind of tools I've mentioned give you something to look into. I'm really sort of hoping it'll give you kind of a chance to sort of experiment. Some of these tools are absolutely amazing, but as we talked about earlier, there's that kind of freemium attached to them. You can get a little bit of the good stuff for free, and then you have to start paying. And of course, with so many tools out there, how many are you going to pay for, and actually how many can people afford to pay for? So yeah, some really great comments in there kind of coming through. Thanks so much for everyone sharing those. I think, yeah, that kind of duality of opportunities and threats, I think is exactly what we're going to kind of touch on in the next session. What I will do as well is I'll make sure I'll send out all of these comments as part of the PowerPoint slides that I share after the session. So thanks to everyone who's kind of shared those. Thanks to everyone who's you know, taken time to kind of participate in the mentees and all those sort of things. So just kind of very finally, before we finish and we kind of wrap up the session, I just want to remind people about the next session that's taking place in Feb. Just another reminder, and that is 15th of Feb from 3 till 4:30, so same time again. Again, you can access this via the QR code on the screen. The link is at the top of the slides, and hopefully you should have you know, kind of seen it on the pod website as well. So as I say, this session is going to be all about learning to work with AI, practical use cases of how it's being used across different industries, some sort of examples that we'll demo on the day as well, so sort of showing you kind of how we're using them within the career service and with sort of within other sort of services as well, and also kind of taking time to think about the kind of critical approach of actually where do you stand as a professional in terms of using AI with your particular job, and how might that change going forward. So that's going to be the real focus of this session. If you do want to get in touch about any of this, feel free to drop me an email or find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, X. I still don't get used to calling it X. Feel free to kind of get in touch. Always happy to have a conversation about this type of stuff, particularly if it's specifically in relation to your job role or just kind of more generally. And if you do want to find a little bit more content about me talking about AI, you don't have to. I run a show for the Career Development Institute called We Are Careers, which goes out kind of fairly regularly. And we've had a couple of episodes talking about AI, and that one in relation specifically to the career sector. And I also produce a weekly newsletter on LinkedIn where we, again, regularly kind of write about this sort of thing. So if it's of interest, feel free to follow me. If not, I won't be offended. So that kind of pretty much brings us to the end of the session, really. I'll stop to kind of field any further questions, but I'll stop the recording there and just say a big thank you to everyone who's kind of joined today, and hopefully see you at the next session on the 15th of Feb.